Everything I ever built had to be within tolerance. 1/1000th of an inch, no more, no less, or the part gets thrown in the scrap bin and you start over. 41 years I lived by that rule. Then my wife died, and I found out my own children don't come with a tolerance chart. They just come with excuses. My son called it old man serious when I was lying in a hospital bed with wires taped to my chest. That's the kind of family I raised. Stick around, because by the end of this one, you'll understand exactly what I was building in that garage while they weren't looking. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 69 years old, and until 2019, I spent my working life on the east side of Dayton, Ohio, machining precision tooling parts for a company called Redline Industrial on Webster Street. 41 years, same floor, same lathe by the end, a Harding HLB-H I could run with my eyes closed. When the plant closed, I took my pension and went home to the house on Fenwick Avenue, the one I paid off in 1998, the one my wife Carol and I raised 3 kids in. I drive a 2011 Ford Ranger with 190,000 miles on it and a dent in the tailgate from when Marcus backed his prom date's car into it in 2001. On Saturdays, I build scale models of steam engines in the garage, the same garage where, 14 years ago, I machined a little brass and steel part that nobody thought twice about. If you ask me what I did for a living, I'll tell you the same thing I've told everyone for 40 years. I just tighten bolts for a living, nothing fancy. That's not exactly true, but we'll get to that. Carol passed in November of 2018, 5 months before Redline shut its doors. Cancer, fast. 11 weeks start to finish. I buried my wife and lost my job in the same winter, and I want you to understand something about that kind of year. It doesn't announce itself as a turning point. Nobody tells you that the people who show up to the funeral aren't the same people who'll show up 6 years later. You just live it month by month, and one day you look up and realize the phone hasn't rung in 3 weeks. I have 3 kids. Denise is the oldest, 44, lives in Columbus, works in logistics for a freight company, married to a man named Curtis, who I like fine but barely know. Marcus is 41, lives in Indianapolis, sells commercial HVAC systems, divorced once, engaged again. Tanya is the youngest, 38, and she's the one who stayed closest to home. 12 minutes from my front door in a rental off Wilmington Pike, works reception at a dental office. 3 kids, 3 different kinds of distance, and I want to walk you through exactly how that distance built itself, brick by brick, because none of it happened in one dramatic moment. It happened the way rust happens, slow, and then all at once. The first crack showed up about 4 months after Carol's funeral. Denise called on what would have been Carol's 68th birthday, and I could hear a meeting going on in the background, someone talking about quarterly freight numbers. She said, "Dad, I've only got a minute. I just wanted to check in." I told her I was doing all right. She said, "Good, good," and then she said she had to jump back on the call. The whole thing lasted 90 seconds. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone after she hung up, looking at Carol's handwriting still taped to the refrigerator, a grocery list she'd never get to use, and I thought, well, she's got a life to run. That's fair. People get busy. Then my birthday came around in March of 2019, and nobody called at all. Not Denise, not Marcus. Tanya sent a text 2 days late that said, "Happy belated. Sorry, I'm the worst." I told myself it happens. The next year, same thing. My birthday came and went with a text from Tanya and silence from the other 2. 2 years running. When I finally said something to Denise about it, gently, not looking for a fight, she got defensive fast. She said, "Dad, I have a life too, you know. I can't be the one who remembers everything for everybody." I didn't say anything back. I've learned that when somebody answers a small thing with that much heat, the small thing was never really the small thing. There's a smaller moment with Tanya from that same stretch of years that I still think about more than I probably should. In the fall of 2022, I asked her, plainly, if she'd want to come over on Saturdays sometimes, just to sit in the garage with me while I worked on the models. No pressure, no agenda, just company. She said that sounded nice, and she meant it. I could tell she meant it. She came twice. Then something would come up. A shift swap at the dental office, a headache. a friend's thing she'd forgotten about, and each time it was reasonable on its own, the kind of thing anyone could understand. But stacked together across 2 years, it added up to a standing invitation that quietly stopped being real. Marcus was a different animal entirely. Marcus called plenty. Marcus called when his transmission went out in 2021 and needed $4,200 he swore he'd pay back within 2 months. I wired it that same afternoon. No questions, because that's what you do for your kid. 2 months came and went. I never said a word about it. Then in the spring of 2023, he called again, and this one hurt worse because he led with, "Dad, I know you're probably tight since the plant closed, but..." And I want you to sit with that phrase for a second because we're going to come back to it. He knew, or he thought he knew. He knew I was tight, and he asked anyway. $6,800 that time for what he called a business opportunity with a guy he'd met at a trade show. I gave it to him. Carol would have told me not to. Carol wasn't there to tell me anything anymore. Tanya's distance looked nothing like her siblings. She lived 12 minutes away, and I probably saw her 4 times a year. It wasn't coldness, not exactly. It was something closer to avoidance, like she couldn't sit in a room with me without seeing Carol's empty chair at the same table. Once early on, I asked her straight out why she didn't come by more. She looked at the floor and said, "I keep meaning to come by, Dad. I just don't know what to say when I get there." I told her she didn't have to say anything. She nodded like she understood, and then 3 more months went by before I saw her again. There was one more moment from those early years I need to tell you about, because it's the one that still sits heaviest with me. In September of 2020, 18 months after Carol died, I had a minor fall in the garage. Nothing serious, a bruised hip and a scraped elbow from slipping on some spilled oil near the lathe. I mentioned it to Denise on our next call, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mentioned the weather. She said, "Dad, you really should think about not being out there alone so much." And then the conversation moved on to something about her son's soccer schedule. Nobody followed up. Nobody asked if I'd gotten it looked at, whether I'd bruised anything worse than I let on, whether the garage floor needed a rubber mat so it wouldn't happen again. I put the mat down myself the following weekend alone, the way I'd started doing most things by then. The one person who never let 3 months go by was Ruth Okafor, my next-door neighbor for 22 years, a retired ICU nurse who'd known Carol since before any of us moved onto Fenwick Avenue. Ruth showed up with a casserole the week of the funeral, and unlike everybody else who brought a casserole that week, Ruth kept showing up. Every Sunday, rain or shine, she'd knock on my door around 4 in the afternoon with something in a dish and sit with me for an hour, sometimes 2. She never asked me how I was doing in that hollow way people ask when they don't want the real answer. She'd ask what I was building in the garage, and she'd actually listen when I told her. I want to pause here and tell you what nobody in my family knew, because it matters for everything that comes after. And I'm not going to explain the whole thing right now. Just hold on to this. In 2010, 4 years before I retired, I machined a part in that garage on a Saturday afternoon. A self-adjusting valve seal I'd been fooling with in my head for months. Something Redline had no interest in because it wasn't in their product line. I patented it on my own dime, quietly, told nobody. Filed it away like a hobby project that never went anywhere. For 11 years, it sat in a drawer. Then, in the fall of 2022, a manufacturing outfit out of Cincinnati came looking for exactly that kind of seal for a new line of industrial pumps. That's where I'll leave it for now. We'll come back to what happened next. I want to tell you about one more thing before we move forward because it matters for what comes later. In early 2023, before the second loan to Marcus, I sat down and actually did the math on what my children had cost me since Carol died. Not out of bitterness, just out of the same habit of measuring things that had carried me through 41 years on a shop floor. Between the 2 loans to Marcus, a few smaller amounts to Denise for things like her daughter's braces that she'd promised to pay back and never mentioned again, and a used car I'd helped Tanya buy in 2021 that she was still, to her credit, paying me back for in small monthly installments. The number came to just over $16,000, none of it framed as a gift by anyone involved, all of it framed as temporary. I never once brought that number up to any of them. I wrote it in the same notebook where, years later, I'd start keeping the other list, the one with dates and phone calls and the exact words people had used. By the time the fifth Thanksgiving without Carol rolled around in November of 2023, this was the shape of my family. Denise called on holidays and major news only, always with somewhere else to be. Marcus called when he needed something, and only when he needed something. Tanya lived close and stayed distant, guilt keeping her circling my block without ever quite landing. And I sat in that house on Fenwick Avenue, mostly alone, with a dead wife's handwriting still on the refrigerator and a patent worth more than any of them could imagine sitting in a filing cabinet nobody had ever opened. Everything I ever built had to be within tolerance. People, I was finding out, don't come with a tolerance chart. You just have to watch and wait and see how far off they'll drift before something forces them back into alignment. What I didn't know yet was how much further mine were about to drift before that happened. The chest pain started on a Tuesday morning in February of 2024, a dull pressure under my breastbone while I was clearing snow off the Ranger's windshield. I didn't think much of it at first. I'm 69. I told myself, everything aches a little these days. By that evening, it hadn't gone away, and it had started running down my left arm, and even a stubborn old machinist knows what that means. Ruth was the one who drove me to Miami Valley Hospital because when I called her instead of calling 911, she didn't argue with me. She just said, "Get in the car, Harold," the way she used to talk to patients 20 years ago, and I got in the car. They ran me through the whole gauntlet that night. Blood work, EKG, a cardiologist named Dr. Aaron Feld, who came in around 11 p.m. with the kind of calm face doctors learn to keep no matter what the numbers say. It wasn't a heart attack, not quite, but it was close enough that he used the word warning 3 separate times before I left that room. Significant blockage, he said. We're going to need to talk about a procedure, possibly soon. Ruth called my 3 kids from the hospital waiting room while I was still hooked up to a monitor. She told me later, and I believe her because Ruth doesn't exaggerate, that Denise picked up on the 4th ring and asked, "Is this urgent? I'm actually walking into something." Ruth said, "Yes, Denise, it's urgent. Your father is in the hospital." Denise said she'd call back in 20 minutes. She called back in 55, and by then I was already being wheeled up to a room on the 4th floor. Tanya picked up right away at least, and she cried on the phone, which I appreciated, but she also said she couldn't come that night because she had an early shift and, in her words, I wouldn't even know what to do there anyway. She came the next afternoon instead, sat with me for 40 minutes, mostly quiet, and left before dinner. Marcus is the one I keep coming back to. Marcus called around midnight, and I answered myself because Ruth had gone home to get some sleep. I told him what Dr. Feld had told me, the blockage, the possible procedure, all of it in the flattest voice I could manage because I didn't want to alarm him. There was a pause on the line, and then Marcus asked, "Is it serious, or just old man serious?" I want you to hear that question again the way I heard it lying in that hospital bed with a needle taped into the back of my hand. Is it serious, or just old man serious? Like there were 2 categories of my life, one that deserved his attention and one that didn't. And he was trying to figure out which drawer to file this in before he decided whether to book a flight. I told him it was fine. Don't worry about it. Get some sleep. That's what I've told all 3 of them my whole life, every time something hurt. It's fine. Don't worry about it. 41 years machining parts to 1,000th of an inch. And somewhere along the way, I never once machined myself a way to say the truth out loud to my own children. Marcus didn't come that week. He sent a text 2 days later that said, "Glad you're doing better. Let me know if you need anything," which is the kind of sentence people write when they've already decided the answer is going to be no. Dr. Feld came by my room again the 2nd morning, checked the monitor, adjusted a medication, and before he left he paused at the foot of the bed and asked, almost offhand, whether I had family nearby who could help me manage things during recovery. I told him I had 3 kids, 2 out of state. He nodded, made a small note, and said something that stuck with me longer than I expected it to. "Recovery goes a lot smoother," he said, "when somebody's actually in the room asking questions with you, not just checking in after the fact." I told him I had a neighbor who filled that role. He didn't say anything else about it, but I noticed he wrote her name down when I gave it to him, in case the hospital needed a contact who'd actually pick up. I stayed in that hospital 4 days. Dr. Feld scheduled me for a stent procedure the following month. Ruth came every single day, twice on Saturday. On the 3rd night, close to midnight, unable to sleep with that monitor beeping every few seconds, I lay there running the numbers on my own family the way I used to run tolerances on a part. Denise, 55 minutes to call back when told her father was in the hospital. Tanya, 40 minutes in the room once. Marcus, is it serious, or just old man serious? And somewhere in a filing cabinet on Fenwick Avenue, a patent that none of them knew existed, attached to a licensing conversation that, unknown to me at that exact moment, was about to move a lot faster than anyone expected. I didn't know yet how fast. I didn't know that in 9 months I'd be sitting at a Thanksgiving table watching my own son try to talk me into signing something I hadn't fully read. I didn't know that Diane Marsh, the patent attorney I'd hired back in 2022 on Ruth's recommendation, was already fielding a serious offer from that Cincinnati manufacturer. All I knew, lying in that bed, was that something in me had shifted. Not anger exactly, something quieter and colder than anger. A decision, forming the way decisions form in a man who's spent his whole life measuring things precisely before he acts on them. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. I came home from the hospital on a Friday, and Ruth stayed with me through the weekend, sleeping in Carol's old sewing room down the hall, which she insisted on doing even though I told her 3 times it wasn't necessary. On Sunday evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and said something that changed the shape of everything that came after. "Harold," she said, "you've been sitting on that patent for 14 years like it's a secret you're ashamed of. It's not a secret, it's a decision you get to make, and you keep not making it." She was right, and I knew she was right, and the next morning I called Diane Marsh's office in Kettering and asked her to walk me through exactly where the Cincinnati deal stood. Diane Marsh had handled my patent filing back in 2010, more or less as a favor to a friend of Carol's, and she'd stayed on it through the quiet years when nothing happened, and then through the last 18 months when something finally did. She told me the manufacturer, a company called Veric Fluid Systems out of Blue Ash, had been licensing similar seals from a competitor for years at a markup that was starting to eat into their margins on a new industrial pump line, and my design solved a wear problem their existing supplier hadn't solved. She said, and I remember this exactly because I wrote it on the back of an envelope sitting right there in my kitchen. "Harold, if this goes the way I think it's going to go, we're not talking about pocket change. We're talking about a licensing structure that could run into 7 figures over the life of the agreement, plus a signing payment up front." I sat there holding that envelope for a long time after we hung up. I told Ruth. I did not tell my children, not because I wanted to punish them, not at first, but because some old instinct in me, the same one that had told them, "It's fine, don't worry about it," for 40 years, told me to wait and see what they'd do with what they already had before I gave them a reason to circle back. And I want to be honest with you, because that's what this channel is about. Part of me was testing them. I'm not proud of it, exactly, but I'm not ashamed of it either. A man who's been overlooked for 6 years develops a certain kind of patience and a certain kind of curiosity about who shows up when there's nothing obvious to show up for. The negotiations with Veric moved through the spring of 2024 in fits and starts, the way these things do. Diane would call every couple of weeks with an update, sometimes good, sometimes frustrating, a counteroffer here, a legal question there. In April, Varick's lawyers wanted additional testing data on the SEAL's performance under high-pressure conditions, which meant Diane and I spent 2 separate afternoons at a testing lab in Cincinnati, verifying numbers I'd known in my bones for 14 years. In May, their negotiator tried to shave the royalty percentage down by 1.5 points, and Diane pushed back hard enough that they backed off within a week. Every one of these updates felt like watching a machine come into alignment, one adjustment at a time, and I found myself looking forward to Diane's calls the way I used to look forward to Carol coming home from her shift at the elementary school. Meanwhile, my actual family kept doing what my actual family had been doing for 6 years. Denise called on Mother's Day, which felt strange since Carol was gone, but I understood it. That was the day she always called, habit outlasting the reason for the habit. She asked how I was recovering. I told her the doctors were pleased with my progress. She said that was great, and then the call moved to her kids' summer camp schedules, and 12 minutes later we hung up, and I realized she'd never once asked what the procedure actually involved or when it had been. Tanya came by twice in May, once for 20 minutes and once for closer to an hour. That second time actually sitting in the garage with me while I worked on a model of a Baldwin steam locomotive, and for a little while it felt like something was thawing. She asked good questions about the model. She laughed at something I said for the first time in longer than I could remember. Then June came and she disappeared again for 5 weeks, and when I finally asked her about it, gently, she said work had been overwhelming. The dental office was short-staffed, and I let it go, because that's what I do. I let things go. Marcus called in June wanting to borrow money again, $11,000 this time, for what he described as a down payment on a townhouse he and his fiancée were buying in Indianapolis. I told him for the first time in my life, no. I said I'd had some unexpected medical expenses and needed to hold on to my savings. There was a long silence on the line, and then Marcus said something I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. He said, "Come on, Dad, you've got the house paid off. You don't need much. You're not exactly hurting." I asked him what made him say that. He said, "I don't know. You've just always been the type who doesn't need a lot." I told him I'd think about it and hung up before I said something I'd regret. That sentence sat in me for days. You've got the house paid off. You don't need much. You're not exactly hurting. My son had built an entire picture of who I was. An old man with a paid-off house and modest needs and not much else. And he'd never once asked me a real question that might have told him different. He wasn't wrong that the house was paid off. He was wrong about almost everything else. And the gap between what he assumed and what was actually true had gotten wide enough by that summer that I started to wonder what else in my family was built on assumptions nobody had bothered to check. In July, Diane called with news that made me sit down at my kitchen table before I let myself react to it. Varick's board had approved the licensing structure in principle. There were still details to finalize, a signing date to set, lawyers on both sides to work through the final language, but the deal, in Diane's words, was as close to done as these things get before the ink's dry. She told me a number for the signing payment alone that I made her repeat twice. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after we hung up, looking at the same spot on the refrigerator where Carol's grocery list used to hang, before I'd finally taken it down that spring because I couldn't look at it anymore without falling apart. I didn't tell anyone but Ruth. Ruth, for her part, had quietly sold her own second car that same month. A reliable little Corolla she'd kept as a backup since her husband passed, because the transmission on her main car had gone and she didn't want to ask me for help covering it while I was still recovering from the stent. I only found this out by accident, seeing the empty spot in her driveway and asking where the Corolla went. She waved it off like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was a woman with no obligation to me at all, quietly absorbing a $5,000 loss rather than add one more thing to my plate. In the same season, my own children were asking me for money I no longer had reason to give them. August brought a different kind of pressure entirely, one I didn't see coming. Tanya called on a Thursday evening, her voice tight in a way I recognized from when she was a teenager, and had done something she was scared to tell me about. She said Marcus had called her, and Denise too, apparently, with a plan. His plan, as Tanya explained it, was this. The three of them should sit me down and talk about options for the house, because in Marcus's words, at 69, living alone, having just had a cardiac scare, it might be time to think about downsizing, maybe even moving somewhere I'd have support nearby. Tanya told me this because she said it didn't sit right with her, and I want to give her real credit for that because it would have been easier for her to just go along. I asked Tanya carefully whether Marcus had said anything about the house's value or about what would happen to any money from a sale. She hesitated, and then she told me something that made the whole picture snap into focus. Marcus had already called a realtor, a woman he found through a coworker in Indianapolis, and asked her, without telling me, to run a rough estimate on what Fenwick Avenue might sell for in the current market. He'd framed it to Tanya as just gathering information so we're prepared to help Dad when the time comes. Tanya said the realtor had apparently come back with a number in the low 200s, and Marcus had said, again according to Tanya, that's not nothing. That could really help him out, or help all of us out if we're the ones managing it for him. Managing it for him. I sat with that phrase for a long time after Tanya hung up. My son, who 6 months earlier had asked whether my hospital scare was serious or just old man serious, had moved from indifference straight to a plan for managing my assets without a single conversation with me in between. I thought about calling him right then and confronting him. I thought about it for almost an hour, sitting in my recliner with the television off, the house dead quiet, the way it had been quiet for 6 years. Instead, I called Diane Marsh the next morning and asked her a very specific question. If someone were to attempt to have a person declared unable to manage their own affairs, what would that process actually require, and what protections existed against it being done without real medical cause? Diane, to her credit, didn't panic or catastrophize. She explained that a guardianship or conservatorship proceeding required documented medical evidence of incapacity, typically from more than one physician, and that a court would appoint an independent evaluator besides. She also told me something I hadn't considered, which is that these things sometimes start smaller and quieter than a courtroom filing. Sometimes, she said, they start with a power of attorney document presented casually at a family gathering, framed as something responsible and loving to have just in case. She asked if anyone in my family had recently suggested I sign anything. They hadn't. Not yet. But Thanksgiving was 3 months away, and something in my gut, the same instinct that used to tell me when a part was going to come out of tolerance before the gauge confirmed it, told me that Thanksgiving was exactly when it would happen. I called Denise directly that same week, not to accuse her of anything, just to ask, plainly, what she knew. She hesitated in a way that told me everything before she said a word. Yes, Marcus had called her too. Yes, he'd mentioned the realtor's number. Yes, she'd told him it made sense to at least look into it given everything. She hadn't told me, she said, because she didn't want to worry me while I was still recovering. I asked her whether it had occurred to her to worry about worrying me by leaving me out of a conversation about my own house instead. She didn't have a good answer for that either, and the call ended shorter than most of ours, both of us a little raw. Then came October, and a visit from Marcus I hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. He drove up from Indianapolis on a Saturday, unannounced, said he happened to be in the area for work, which I later learned wasn't true. Priya let it slip to Tanya that the trip had been planned around seeing me specifically. He sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes making small talk before he pulled a single folded sheet of paper out of his jacket pocket. Not the full folder yet, just a general durable power of attorney form he said he'd downloaded. Just to have on hand, no pressure. Only if I ever wanted it. I told him I'd think about it. He left it on my kitchen counter anyway, next to the fruit bowl, like leaving it in the room might do the convincing his conversation hadn't. I photographed it that night and emailed the picture straight to Diane Marsh before I threw the original in the recycling bin. Diane's response came back within the hour, and it wasn't reassuring in the way I'd hoped. She told me that a document like that, signed casually at a kitchen table with no independent counsel present, wasn't necessarily invalid, and that if I'd been anything less than fully alert that day, if I'd had a bad afternoon, a confused moment, anything a lawyer could later point to, it could have become a foothold for exactly the kind of managing it for him arrangement Tanya had warned me about. She told me, only half joking, that it might be worth documenting my own competency proactively rather than reactively, which is exactly what sent me to Dr. Feld's office 3 weeks later, asking him to note my cognitive screening and writing. I spent September and October doing two things at once, and neither one of my kids knew about either of them. The first was finalizing the Veric licensing agreement with Diane, which moved into its final stages, contracts drafted, redlined, revised, a signing date tentatively set for the first week of December, contingent on a few last technical sign-offs that Diane assured me were formalities at that point. The second was quietly documenting everything I could about the pattern my family had settled into, not out of spite, but because some part of me knew I might need to be able to say, clearly and with dates, exactly what had and hadn't happened over the past 6 years. I wrote it down the way I used to write down machine tolerances, plainly, with dates and numbers, no editorializing. February 2019, birthday. No call from Denise or Marcus. March 2020, same. April 2021, $4,200 to Marcus, unpaid. Spring 2023, $6,800 more, unpaid. February 2024, hospital, Denise, 55 minutes to call back, Marcus asking if it was serious. August 2024, realtor contacted without my knowledge, estimate in the low 200s, phrase used, managing it for him. I kept that list in the same drawer as the original patent filing from 2010, and there was something almost funny to me about that. Two documents in the same drawer, one describing what I'd built with my hands and one describing what my family had built without meaning to, both of them 14 years and 6 years respectively in the making, both of them about to come due at the same table. Ruth knew all of it. Dr. Feld, my cardiologist, knew part of it too, because at my follow-up appointment in October, I asked him, plainly, to document in my chart that my cognition and decision-making capacity were fully intact given my age and recent cardiac history, for my own peace of mind. He looked at me for a moment, the way doctors do when they sense there's a story behind a request like that. And then he ran a quick cognitive screening right there in the office, scored me well within normal range, and wrote it into my file without asking a single follow-up question. I've always appreciated a professional who knows when not to ask. There was one more thing that happened that November, something I only learned about because Ruth's daughter, Adaeze, had gone to Marcus and Priya's engagement party in Indianapolis as a +1 for a mutual friend. She mentioned it to Ruth almost in passing, not realizing what it would mean once Ruth repeated it to me. Apparently, at some point in the evening, someone had asked Marcus, casually, whether his father might help out with wedding costs the way parents sometimes do. Marcus had laughed it off and said, according to Adaeze, my dad's a retired machinist living off Social Security in a paid-off house in Dayton. He's not exactly sitting on anything. That was the same month he'd already had a realtor run numbers on that house behind my back, the same year he'd asked me for $11,000 and been told no. I sat with that for a long while after Ruth told me. It wasn't the money that bothered me. It was the two different fathers he was carrying around in his head at the same time. One too broke to help and one worth managing, whichever version happened to be useful in the moment he was standing in. I called Diane the next day, not about Marcus, but about something that had been eating at me since Adaze's story reached me. I asked her, plainly, whether there was any version of the Veric deal that could still fall apart between now and Thanksgiving. She told me the truth, which I've always appreciated about Diane even when the truth is inconvenient. There was one contingency clause left open, a final internal compliance review on Veric's end that their legal team had said would clear sometime before year's end, no firmer than that. If it slipped past December 31st, the whole structure would need to be renegotiated under a new fiscal year, and there was no guarantee the terms would hold. I asked her to push them, as hard as she reasonably could, for a firm date. She said she'd try, but these things move on their own schedule, and there wasn't much a 70-year-old machinist's patience could do to speed up a corporate compliance department. So, I waited, the way I've waited on most things in my life, quietly, without telling anyone what was actually at stake, watching the calendar the same way I used to watch a gauge creep toward the edge of a tolerance window. Every day that November that I didn't hear from Diane felt like a part sitting half-machined on the table, not yet within spec, not yet scrapped either. Thanksgiving was coming regardless of whether the deal cleared in time, and some nights, lying awake, I honestly didn't know which outcome I was more afraid of. Watching 14 years of quiet work evaporate over a paperwork delay, or watching it come through and having to decide in real time, in front of my own children, what to do with the truth I'd been sitting on. By early November, Diane called with what she described as good news arriving faster than expected. Varick's final legal sign-off had come through 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Barring something unforeseen, the agreement would be executed the week after Thanksgiving, and the signing payment would land in my account within days of that. She asked if I wanted to celebrate. I told her I wasn't sure celebrate was the right word yet. I told her I was waiting to see what Thanksgiving looked like first. Thanksgiving landed on the 28th that year, and for the first time since Carol died, all 3 of my kids came home on the same day. Denise flew in from Columbus with Curtis. Marcus drove up from Indianapolis with his fiancée, a woman named Priya I'd met exactly twice. Tanya, of course, was already 12 minutes away. Ruth came too, at my invitation, because by that point she'd earned a seat at that table more than most people with my last name had. The morning went easily enough. I cooked the turkey the way Carol taught me 30 years ago. A little too much sage in the stuffing the way she always did it. Denise's kids ran around the backyard in coats too thin for late November. For an hour or two, sitting in that kitchen with all 3 of my children under one roof, I let myself feel something close to peace, even though I already knew, the way you know weather is changing before the sky confirms it, that the afternoon wasn't going to stay peaceful. It started right after the meal, over pie, when Marcus cleared his throat in the particular way he does when he's rehearsed something. He said he wanted to talk to me, to all of us really, about the future, about making sure I had support systems in place given everything that had happened with my heart that year. Denise nodded along in a way that told me she'd been briefed ahead of time. Tanya stayed quiet, looking at her plate, and I understood that quiet, because she'd already told me what was coming. Marcus pulled out a folder, an actual folder, printed pages inside it, and I want you to sit with that image for a second because I certainly did. My son had prepared paperwork for a Thanksgiving conversation with his father. He said he'd talked to a realtor, that the house on Fenwick Avenue was probably worth more than I realized, that with my medical situation and living alone, it might make sense to think about options, and that he'd drafted something, just a starting point, a general power of attorney, so that if anything ever happened, we wouldn't be stuck scrambling. He slid the folder across the table toward me like it was nothing more than a permission slip. Curtis, Denise's husband, shifted in his seat and looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Priya kept her eyes down, twisting her napkin under the table where she probably thought no one could see. The grandkids had been sent to the living room to watch a movie 10 minutes earlier, which I now understood had been planned that way, timed so this conversation could happen without small ears listening. Somebody had thought this through. Somebody had rehearsed it. I looked at the pie in front of me, untouched, a slice of the pecan Ruth always brings, and I remember thinking, with a kind of distant clarity, that I hadn't felt this calm in years. "Dad?" Marcus said again, filling the silence the way he does when a silence makes him nervous. "This isn't about taking anything away from you. It's about being smart, proactive. You'd still be in charge of everything. This is just, a safety net." A safety net. I turned that phrase over once in my head. Quiet, the way I used to turn a part over in my hand looking for a flaw the naked eye might miss. I asked Marcus calmly what exactly he thought I couldn't manage on my own. He said, "Well, the medical stuff, the finances, the house, all of it. It's a lot for one person, especially at your age, especially after the scare you had." I asked him whether he'd spoken to my cardiologist. He said, "No, of course not. That wasn't the point." I asked him whether he'd spoken to me at any point in the last 6 years about how I was actually managing on my own, financially or otherwise. He didn't have an answer for that one right away. That's when my phone rang. Diane Marsh's name lit up the screen, and I almost let it go to voicemail out of instinct, out of 40 years of not wanting to interrupt a family gathering for business. But something told me to answer it, right there at the table, on speaker, because for once in my life I wanted my family to hear something at the exact moment I heard it. "Harold," Diane said, her voice bright even through the phone's tinny speaker. "I've got great news. Varick's finance team just confirmed the wire. It cleared this morning, 2 days ahead of schedule. The signing payment is in your account as of 9:40 this morning, and the licensing agreement is fully executed as of an hour ago. Congratulations, you're officially in business with them." The kitchen went completely silent. Denise's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Marcus's hand was still resting on that folder, frozen there. Tanya looked up from her plate for the first time in 10 minutes. I thanked Diane, told her I'd call her back that evening, and set the phone down on the table next to Marcus's folder. "What was that?" Marcus asked, and I could hear underneath the confusion the beginning of something that sounded almost like fear. So I told them, not everything, not all 14 years of it in one breath, but enough. I told them about the valve seal I'd machined in the garage in 2010, the patent I'd filed quietly because it felt like a private thing back then, something between me and a hobby I loved, nothing anyone else needed to know about. I told them about Varick Fluid Systems, about Diane Marsh, about 18 months of negotiations that had just closed that very morning, on Thanksgiving, with a signing payment large enough that Denise actually put her fork down and asked me to repeat the number. I watched 3 different faces try to process the same information in 3 completely different ways, and if there's one thing I want you to take from this video, it's that watching that happen taught me more about my children in 90 seconds than the previous 6 years combined. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one. Marcus recovered first, and not in the way you'd hope. His face did a strange thing. A flicker of something that might have been shame quickly replaced by a kind of recalculating energy. The look of a man doing math in his head. He said, "Dad, that's incredible. That's really incredible." And then, almost in the same breath, "Does this mean, obviously you don't need to think about the house stuff now, but if you ever wanted to invest some of that, I actually know a guy who—" I stopped him there. I told him, gently, but with a flatness in my voice I don't think he'd ever heard from me before, that we could talk about all of that another time, and that for now I'd like him to take his folder home with him. Denise was the one who finally reached across the table and slid the folder back toward Marcus herself, closing it gently, the way you'd close a door on a room nobody needed to be standing in anymore. She didn't say anything cruel to him. She just said, quietly, "Not tonight, Marcus." And something about the way she said it, calm instead of accusing, seemed to land harder on him than if she'd yelled. He did take it home, and to be honest with you, in the week since, Marcus hasn't fully changed. He's called more often, that's true, 3 times in December alone, which is more than he called in the entire year before. But there's still an angle to those calls, a way he circles toward money even when he's trying not to. I'm not going to pretend that 6 years of one pattern gets erased by a single Thanksgiving. What I will say is that he did finally, in January, wire back $4,000 of the $11,000 he's owed me over the years, unprompted, with a text that just said, "Figured I should start somewhere." Priya, for what it's worth, called me herself in February, without Marcus knowing, just to say she was sorry for the folder, that she'd told him beforehand it felt wrong and he'd talked her into believing it was practical instead. I appreciated that call more than she probably realizes. I don't know if that's the beginning of something real or just a man managing his image. I've decided I don't have to know yet. I can watch, the way I always have, and see what the pattern does over time. Denise reacted differently. She went quiet at the table, quieter than I'd seen her in years, and then she asked if she could talk to me alone in the kitchen while the others cleared plates. She apologized, not in a grand way, but plainly, the way I raised her to apologize when she was young, and it actually meant something. She said she'd let work become an excuse for not showing up, that she'd told herself I was fine because it was easier than confronting the fact that maybe I wasn't, and that finding out about the patent, about 14 years of me quietly building something on my own without a single one of them noticing, made her realize how little she actually knew about my life. Since Thanksgiving, Denise calls every Sunday now. Real calls, 20, 30 minutes. Not the 90-second check-ins from before. She flew back in January just to see the house. No occasion, no holiday, just to sit at the kitchen table and talk. That visit, she brought her daughter along, my granddaughter, who I'd only ever seen at holidays and birthdays before, and the two of them stayed the whole weekend. Denise slept in Carol's old sewing room, the same room Ruth had slept in the week I came home from the hospital, and Sunday morning I found her at the kitchen table before I'd even gotten up, going through an old photo album she'd pulled off the shelf without asking, crying quietly over a picture of Carol from a 4th of July cookout in 1998. She didn't try to hide it when I walked in. She just looked up and said, "I forgot how much I missed this house." And for the first time in 6 years, I believed her completely. Tanya is the one who surprised me most because Tanya is the one who actually changed something structural about her life rather than just her habits. In December, she told me she was looking at breaking her lease early and moving into a duplex 4 minutes from Fenwick Avenue instead of 12. She did it in February. She's the one who drives me to my cardiology follow-ups now, sits in the waiting room, asks Dr. Feld actual questions about what my numbers mean. She still gets that look sometimes, the one that used to send her out my door after 20 minutes, but she stays through it now. Last month, she asked me to teach her how to run the lathe in the garage, and I want you to understand what that meant to a man who spent 41 years believing nobody in his family would ever care what he actually did with his hands. At my most recent follow-up, Dr. Feld looked over his glasses at Tanya sitting beside me, taking notes on her phone, and told me, with a small smile, that I was the only patient on his afternoon schedule who'd shown up with backup. She's already asked when the next appointment is. I didn't have to remind her. Ruth, I made sure, was taken care of properly, and not out of guilt or obligation, but because a woman who quietly sold her own car rather than add to my burden deserved to never have to make that choice again. I replaced the Corolla in December, a newer one, and when she tried to refuse it, I told her the same thing she'd told me in my kitchen the week I came home from the hospital. It's not a secret you should be ashamed of accepting. It's a decision you get to make. Diane tells me the Varick agreement is already generating quarterly payments ahead of even her own projections, and she started fielding interest from a second manufacturer about a different part I'd all but forgotten was sitting in that same filing cabinet. A smaller thing, less promising on paper, but she says it's worth another look. I told her I'd think about it. Some habits apparently don't fully retire even after everything else changes. The house on Fenwick Avenue is still mine. I never sold it, never signed Marcus's folder, never needed to. Some things about my family are different now, and I'd be lying if I told you all of it is fixed because Marcus still has some circling to do before I fully trust the shape of it. And Denise's Sunday calls are only 4 months old, still new enough that I catch myself waiting for them to stop the way everything else stopped after Carol died. But Tanya moved 4 minutes away and means it. Ruth still comes every Sunday, and now, more often than not, so does at least one of my kids. Everything I ever built had to be within tolerance, 1/1000th of an inch, no more, no less. I used to think that rule only applied to metal, to parts you could measure with a caliper and check against the blueprint. I know better now. Turns out I did build something within tolerance after all. I just didn't know it yet. Sitting alone in that garage for 14 years, machining a small brass and steel part I thought nobody would ever care about. It turned out to matter more than I could have guessed, not because of what it was worth, but because of what it finally showed my family about who I'd been the whole time they weren't looking. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.